Welcome to AP U.S. History. We're talking about World War II. America gets involved in the war when the Japanese attack on December 7th, 1941. It will take us a while to get geared up for the war effort, but by 1943, we're outproducing all of our enemies. At home, women are encouraged to work in the war industry. They're going to set up some boards to make sure that women and men are treated fairly on the job to avoid strikes. Um, Certainly, there are more workers, fewer consumers because there was rationing going on. Wages were kept pace with inflation, mainly because they wanted to keep peace between the workers and industry. The Office of Economic Mobilization we talked about, they froze the prices of certain things and imposed rationing on tires and gasoline and sugar and so forth. Things that they felt were vital to the war effort. Meat was also rationed. Corn and wheat weren't. To fund the war, taxes were increased, and also the selling of war bonds, as they had done in World War I. The national debt was $49 billion by 1945. It has increased fivefold. The Smith-Conley Antitrust Act was passed in 43. It authorized the government to seize plants or mines if there was a strike on the horizons. Almost a half a million United Mine Workers went on strike, but they were denied a raise in pay by the National War Labor Board. Said if they didn't go back, that the mines would be taken over. Of course, they settled this and they moved on. Bonds are going to be the way that a large part of the war is financed. So do your part, be patriotic, and buy bonds. Certainly, there was discrimination during the war. African American rights issues are still a thorn in America's side because African Americans have not received their just dues in our society. During World War I, there was a great migration of African Americans going north to work in the war industry. During World War II, massive amounts of migration will occur from the south to the north to work in these factories on the west coast and in the north. Certainly, there was still racial tension, and it plagued 47 cities. The race riots in Detroit, 25 blacks killed, 9 whites killed, 6,000 troops called out to restore order. Blacks denied many jobs in the war industry. Philip Randolph, who is the father of the civil rights movement in some respects, went to Washington and demanded that blacks be given their fair share of the jobs and treated fairly by the government. And if they weren't, they were going to go on a boycott. FDR knows that he needs African Americans to work in the war industry and keep America afloat, and he will cave into their demands, and blacks will receive better treatment in the war industry, and they'll be given jobs. So they're going to have equal access to defense jobs because of this protest. Desegregation of armed forces and federal agencies will occur mostly on the civilian side. In the armed forces, segregation is still rampant. Here shows a picture of Philip Randolph, certainly someone fighting for the rights of African Americans. On the road looking for work, people moving to the north or to the west to work in the war industry, and certainly there were segregated units of African Americans during the war. It's not going to be until Truman becomes president after the war that this is segregated units will be done away with. FDR, by executive order, issues the Fair Employment Practice Committee, an order that institutes the Fair Employment Practice Committee to make sure that African Americans are treated fairly in the war industry. government agency, job training programs, defense and industry ended segregation. Uh, and again, we call Philip Randolph, dubbed the father of civil rights movement at this time. The NAACP this is an organization for African Americans, will grow from 50,000 to a half a million at the end of the war. Mexican Americans during the war, there was something called the Basario program. This issues short-term work permits to Mexican workers to engage in the farm production. They were harvesting the crops and growing the crops. This shows FDR forced to take action to help African Americans because of Philip Randolph. And Executive Order 8802 is put through to make sure that that happens. There was something called the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles in 1943. What it really amounted to were American servicemen picking on young Latinos in Los Angeles. They objected to what they were wearing and the fact that they weren't in the war effort. And they caused racial tension to break out. So the sailors were roaming around, tearing clothes and cutting the hair of Latinos. Radio reports blamed the Zooters, these people wearing a particular kind of suit, clothing. Later, Earl Warren will reveal the truth that it was really white servicemen who were causing the problems. The Japanese Americans during the war, by Executive Order 9066 in 1942, this authorized the War Department to declare the West Coast as a war theater. And because of that, 100,000 Japanese Americans will be rounded up and sent to 10 camps located in 7 states. Here shows the zoot suits, particular kind of dress worn by Latinos, and this was objected to by white servicemen, said that they were wasting the material. Here shows people being told to come to various places on the West Coast to be transported to internment camps that were located in the war zone. Within 72 hours, in most cases, you had to sell what you had and whatever belongings you could carry and report and be sent to a camp where you would spend the rest of the war. And they were treated as prisoners. They had armed guards, and they were confined there. It isn't until about 1946 that they were released. All the property and the things that the Japanese Americans lost, for the most part, are never recovered. Not until President Clinton in 1990s issued an order saying that descendants who were still alive or during this internment camp would be eligible for $20,000. So 48 hours, 72 hours, you were on your way to a camp. Now, German Americans and Italian Americans were never relocated like the Japanese. This actually represented the greatest violation of civil rights during World War II. Karamatsu versus U.S. Supreme Court upheld the internment. This is after the war is over. It's interesting to note that no act of sabotage was ever proven against Japanese Americans, and eventually all the camps are closed by 1946. And in 1990, Congress appropriated, at President Clinton's insistence, that $20,000 be paid to people who were internees. It shows a camp of Jerome located in Arkansas. There were a few that were located away from the West Coast, and there was a couple of camps in Arkansas. The Grand Alliance, Allies' objectives and operations. The nice thing about AP U.S. history is that you don't have to know a lot about the battles. They're not going to ask you very many questions about such things. The objective was that destroy Hitler first and deal with Japan later. A lot of Americans object to this because they feel that Pearl Harbor was the Japanese, and we should focus our attention on them. But FDR will go along with Churchill, and we will concentrate most of our efforts against Hitler and Italy. There was an economic blockades of Germany and Italy. Air attack Germany. Peripheral strikes in the Mediterranean. We will attack North Africa, eventually defeat the Germans there, and then move to Sicily and up the Italian peninsula. The Russians will become our allies during World War II. Remember, they had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, but Germany will violate that. We will help Russia, and we will also help Great Britain and France and our allies. We will be the arsenal of democracy, as we were in World War I. There will be a final assault on the Germans in 1944 when we invade Normandy. This shows the European theater of operations. The brown indicates the area controlled by the Germans. This is their furthest expansion. And eventually we will push them back. Allied defeats during the first 6 months, it seemed as though we couldn't get out of our way. We were losing on all areas in the Pacific. The British were likewise feeling the pain. Germans sunk about 8 million tons of Allied supplies, almost brought Great Britain to her knees, but eventually we will convoy our ships there, and we will turn the tide in the Atlantic. The Axis powers were pressing on all fronts at one time in 1942. The Burma Road from India to China is cut. This is by the Allies to help the Chinese, because they will be our allies during World War II. This shows the Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, that started in 1939, September 1st. This is the German troops marching in on Warsaw. This was the evacuation of Dunkirk. This was a terrible loss to the French and the British. French will surrender a few weeks later. This man's not crying because his country has been defeated. He's crying that he's at happiness that the Germans are marching into Paris. The Allies' turning points in the war: the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942 will turn the tide. El Alamein in North Africa. Eventually, the Americans will defeat the Japanese fleet at Midway, and then we'll start an island hopping campaign in the Pacific. And our main goal is to push the Japanese back to their homeland and then invade Japan. The Allied forces invade Europe in 1944. The Germans will surrender in 1945. Japan will surrender in 1945, about 6 months later, after the dropping of the atomic bomb. This shows the number of casualties at Stalingrad, and we will stop right there, and we'll pick this up next time.